This is Melissa, and today is the 14th of April, 2024, and I am going to replay for you today a talk that Alan did when he filled in for Jackie Petru on Sweet Liberty, so solo there on January 25, 2006. And I've made one slight edit, but I'll post the transcript so that you can read it if you want to. I just edited out something topical that pertained to that time in 2006. You'll notice that some of the themes and things that he mentions, he also brought up in an interview which I posted just a few weeks ago and retitled The British Empire. But, maybe that's repetition for the heart of thinking, and it is all interesting. In this talk, he talked about very high sciences, not 50 years ahead of us, but hundreds of years ahead. And he also mentioned the Aryan, what is sometimes called the Aryan invasion into India, the Proto-Iranians. And so the word Aryan in Proto-Iranian means of the Iranians. So this is just me talking as an introduction, and it might be just a few things that I was thinking once I chose this talk yesterday afternoon. And actually this was another Prince suggestion. I got a card in the mail that he posted the day before his surgery, the day after we spoke on Real History, and I haven't been able to connect with him, so I hope he's recovering well from that. But he made this suggestion of a talk, and I agree. It's a good one. I hope that you're all well, doing well. I had a particularly bad week, which I don't want to get into the particulars of. Instead, I think I'll tell you about some of the better parts of the week. My neighbor across the street, they redid some of their landscaping, the hedges around their house, and they pulled up a lot of irises that they had there. And she gave me about 50 or 60 irises. And so I planted those in various places in my yard, and that's cheerful. And the other high point of a bad week was that I heard from a lot of people. I received a lot of mail this week, letters and emails, and naturally I haven't responded to almost any of it, but I have read it, and the overall tone of everything that I received was both educational to me and supportive, and I really appreciate all of it. There were some things I gave me an idea that I ought to start reading a passage or two here and there from letters and emails that I received, because people have such interesting and unique insights. And I also had several phone conversations last week. And one of the conversations that I had was the first time that I'd ever spoken with a young listener who's, I think, about 24. Bright young man, and he's a reader. So he's read quite a lot in the last few years. He's been at this for several years already, and that always made Alan happy when young people discovered his work, and it makes me happy too. In our conversation, he mentioned to me that I had put up a Redux a while back, and I did recall the Redux and what he was talking about. He said that Alan mentioned an extended version of the Balfour Declaration. At the time that I was working on that Redux, I knew then that I had never seen that extended version of the Balfour Declaration, and I was curious about it, but I have not followed up to look for it. But as we were talking, we just kind of went all over the place in the conversation. And because of his question about the Balfour Declaration, it reminded me of the Society for Psychical Research, which was they now call themselves a society that investigates parapsychology, even what you might call the paranormal experiences. And so while we were talking, I just looked up that wiki for the Society for Psychical Research online, because I knew that Arthur Balfour had been one of the presidents of that organization. And I was just relaying to him that information and other interesting people who had been the president. When it was formed in the late 19th century, the first president was Henry Sidgwick. And a little later on, Arthur Balfour was the president for about a year. And immediately following Arthur Balfour was William James. And William James was an early American psychologist, and he's sometimes referred to as the father of American psychology. And James is interesting because he didn't confine himself just to what we think of as what psychology and psychological investigations are, but he was, in a sense, like a Swedenborgian, or the earlier people who explored mysticism. He was open to that as well. And I just mention that because I find it interesting that Freud, who was approached to write something for them, he did, but wanted to keep his distance from the organization, because he told them, and this was quite an accurate statement, I'm sure, that he was propagating and popularizing psychoanalysis and giving it a scientific veneer, if you will. And he felt that mixing it with these kinds of researches and explorations would be detrimental. But it might go without saying that you have to be very careful of who you let and what kinds of thoughts you let get into your head, because there's a lot more to psychology and psychiatry, of course, than pharmaceuticals, and there's a lot more to psychology than just helping you work your way through your problems. It does have its inception in interesting experiments. After William James was Gerald Balfour. And I had already looked into this society before, so I knew that Gerald was Arthur Balfour's brother. As I was talking to this young man, I came to one of the later presidents, who they listed as Mrs. Sidgwick. Mrs. Sidgwick was the wife of Henry Sidgwick, who was the founding president of the organization. But much more interesting than that was that she was Arthur Balfour's sister. I think they referred to him, I don't have that page up right now, but I believe they referred to this little clique as the Cecil Club. Arthur Conan Doyle and other spiritualists were involved in this, but because the organization often appeared to take a skeptical approach to their investigations, and Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame was a true believer, you might say. And so they broke away and formed their own society. It's just interesting, Alan talked a lot about spiritualism and how that took hold on the public imagination after World War I, because the loss of life was so tremendous and people were searching for meaning and explanations, and was there life after death? But that is not to say that the Society for Psychical Research was a purely scientific body in the way that we think of scientific now. And I just qualify that because I will often have an exchange with people who that lean towards rational explanations or the scientific explanation, and they want to debunk the other. But my caution, it's for me so much as your own personal observation and your own personal experiences. And if you present me with, quote, scientific, end quote, explanations for things, I'm usually not that impressed, because I do really believe what Alan presented to us as the 3 levels of science, and probably much more beyond those 3 levels. And I think, as he points out in this talk, so far ahead of us. So anything that's presented as scientific evidence contemporarily is unimpressive to me. In this talk, Alan also talks about nonlinear thinking and the importance of nonlinear thinking to get beyond level 1 reality. And I think that comment of his, which he stressed 2 or 3 times during the talk, was helpful to me in thinking about the Society for Psychical Research and experiments, simply because if you look this up online, you find a society that's been around for 145, close to probably 150 years now. And like any other old organization that was formed for a purpose, especially by people like Arthur Balfour, you're going to have circles, the inner circle, the outer circle, etc. So I try to think linearly, and ask myself questions like, why? Because all we'll get are the standard explanations, the whitewashed, sanctioned reasons why an organization like that was started. But they don't satisfy me. So I just have the open-ended question, why? This is a direct quote from this talk. Alan said, "Sciences are used beyond the comprehension of most people. Apart from the very, very advanced electronics which are used, there are other means of applying science, or transmitting signals, you might say. And where they are scientifically, I don't believe is just 50 years ahead." So we can ponder that for a bit. Now, book club, partly because I've been so busy for a couple of months now, running at full pace, and partly because I had a wickedly awful week, I wasn't able to check into the Telegram site but just a couple of times. But I see that Darren and his wife Andrea are keeping it going gangbusters. There's a lot going on, a lot of commenting back and forth. And where we are in the reading for April are the 2 sections. The first is called The First World War, 1914 to 1918. And the second section covered this month is Versailles System and Return to Normalcy. So I wanted to just read just a little section of, starting on my page 246, and the section called The First World War, 1914 to 1918. This is talking, I'll just dive in, and it doesn't really, the context doesn't matter that much, and the players don't matter that much. But it says, while McMahon was negotiating with Hussein, the government of India, through Perry Cox, was negotiating with Ibn Saud of Najd, and that was basically the precursor of what is now modern-day Saudi Arabia. And in an agreement of December 26, 1915, recognized his independence. So they recognized Ibn Saud's independence in return for a promise of neutrality in the war. Shortly afterward, on May 16, 1916, an agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, from the names of the chief negotiators, was signed between Russia, France, and Britain. Early in 1917, Italy was added to the settlement. It partitioned the Ottoman Empire in such a way that little was left to the Turks except the area within 200 or 250 miles of Ankara. Russia was to get Constantinople and the Straits, as well as northeastern Anatolia, including the Black Sea coast. Italy was to get the southwestern coast of Anatolia from Smyrna to Adalia. France was to get most of the eastern Anatolia, etc., etc. Skipping down here, it was envisaged that western Anatolia around Smyrna would go to Greece. The Holy Land itself was to be internationalized. The next document concerned with the disposition of the Ottoman Empire was the famous Balfour Declaration of November 1917. Probably no document of the wartime period except Wilson's 14 points has given rise to more disputes than this brief statement of less than 11 lines. Much of the controversy arises from the belief that it promised something to somebody and that this promise was in conflict with other promises, notably with the McMahon Pledge to Sharif Hussein. The Balfour Declaration took the form of a letter from British-born Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild, one of the leading figures in the British Zionist movement. Okay, so that is the only little bit of Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope that I'm going to read for book club, but it kind of ties into other things that I happened to be looking at. That tells us about the Sykes-Picot agreement. But I wanted to look up and see who the player was. Not Picot, but Sykes is who I homed in on there. So Mark Sykes, Colonel Sir Tatton Benvenuto Mark Sykes, 6th Baronet. Okay, hold that long name in your heads, and I'll come back. Meanwhile, this week, a minor player within the United States kind of crossed my radar, and I looked into him. His name is Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, Vivek Ramaswamy is called an entrepreneur. He made most of his money in the pharmaceutical industry, and he ran for president for the Republican, to be candidate for the Republican Party for president of the U.S. for the 2024 U.S. presidential election. And so why I was looking into him is neither here nor there, but what I was struck by when I looked at him was it said that Vivek Ramaswamy was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Indian Hindu immigrant parents. His parents are Tamil-speaking Brahmins from Kerala. Talked about his father being a graduate of the National Institute of Technology, Calcutta, or I guess it is called Calcutta. I don't really know for sure. His parents immigrated from the Palakkad district in Kerala, where the family had an ancestral home in a traditional agraharam in the town of Vadakancherry. Now, brief little side trip here. An agraharam was a grant of land that had along with it a royal income. And if you look at pictures of agraharams and kind of read a little bit about them, it's almost like in medieval times when you'd have the lord and the manor and then all the little peasant huts about that. They were run by Brahmins for religious purposes to maintain the land as possibly something like a pilgrimage site. The Brahmins are the priestly, or were the priestly class. So Alan mentioned Brahmins and Aryans in this talk. And so this little trip looking into Ramaswamy, he was also incidentally married to another immigrant's daughter, and she was of the Brahmin class. And they're very, very rich, multi-millionaires, almost a billionaire. Now, when I looked into the Aryan invasion, it is sometimes scholarly downplayed, that word invasion, that it was more of a slow progression. Some people, some scholars even suggest that it wasn't an actual peoples, but more of a language that moved in very, very slowly over time. But this Aryan invasion has been linked to Nazism, of course, and therefore race. So I got to looking into Aryan yesterday, and I stumbled upon different scholarly ideas of Aryanism and what the word meant from the Vedas. Brahman, Brahma, from the Vedas. Aryan as described in the Vedas. And I want to read you a passage here because I think this ties in with Alan's talk. It is posited that perhaps this linguistic light versus dark was not about race or skin color at all, but that the light represented rights, as in R-I-T-E-S, vows, as in oaths, law, whose law, I ask, versus the dark, which would be, I'm saying, I didn't read this, but I'm saying the profane, those in the dark. So this gives me a very different idea about Aryanism, just something to ponder on. And if I can find this page here. So this is something, I can post this up and you can look at it yourselves, but it says racial wars in the Veda, how misinterpretations of Vedic hymns led to the myth of the Aryan race. So I'm just going to scroll and kind of pick out a few little things. Many people who argue in favor of Aryan invasion theory mention that in Rig Veda there are references to enemies of Vedic Aryans having dark skin. But in reality, in most of these instances, it is clear that the dark skin is associated with Avrita, or those who observe no law or vow or rites. Get it? They take no oaths. They have dark skin. Versus those in the light who have taken the vow, taken oaths. So they are, perhaps you might say, illumined. They give another passage. If we look at the context, they write, the dusky skin in this verse is associated again with lawlessness, rightlessness, vowlessness. And the heavenly light quells this. So certainly this is something supernatural, the author says, and not a literal mention of a dark-complexioned people. Active and bright have they come forth, impetuous in speed like bulls, driving the black skin far away. Active and bright. Remember 1,000 points of light? Sun, soul, illumined. It's all very, very interesting to me. Then I found a paper that had been written on the Brahmins. It's entitled, The Brahmin, the Aryan, and the Powers of the Priestly Class, Puzzles in the Study of Indian Religion. Now, in this talk, Alan discusses how religions are formed. This is an ancient, you might even call it science, of shaping a religion. But I wanted to read just a little section here about how the Brahmins perceived themselves and how they were perceived by others. The authors who wrote about them attributed extraordinary powers to the Brahmin priestly class. Through knowledge of the Varna system, they could control the natural, supernatural, and social worlds by performing rituals. These magical powers were used to protect kings and have them accede to Brahmanical supremacy, and when the Brahmins lost the support of the ruling classes, they could always fall back on their supernatural powers. So it discusses the fact that the Brahmins could not have elicited this kind of belief or following if they had not been able to demonstrate the actual power. It said the fact that this priesthood succeeded at having other groups endorse its exceptional status, even though several had far more military, political, and economic power, indicates that these groups must have attributed some such powers to the Brahmin. No matter the self-image of the priestly class, it could gain a special status in society only if others also embraced this image. For many centuries, Brahmins presented themselves and were accepted by a growing proportion of the population as the masters of all knowledge worth knowing. This included forms of knowledge that provide power, among these rites and spells. Clearly, this aspect of Brahmanical knowledge added immensely to their attraction, not least among those with access or aspirations to worldly power. Generally speaking, Brahmins were thought of and thought of themselves as being closest to what we may call the sacred. And it's interesting because when you get into the etymology of Brahman versus Brahma, Brahma is the word that is ultimate reality or ultimate truth, or even what might be creator God of the universe, whereas a Brahmin is a member of the highest caste in traditional Hindu society. But I don't know, I'm not a linguist, but I wouldn't make a really sharp delineation there between creator God and highest caste. Got me to thinking a little bit about, who's in charge where, and were there other Brahmins lurking about. And I dived into Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And as far as I can determine, certainly by education and wealth, he would be Brahmin, but he's not claiming to be of the Brahmin class. He is married to the daughter of a billionaire, and they have a lot of money and estates, and he wasn't really elected. So it's interesting. Contemporarily, they would define a Brahmin as someone who is highly educated, often in technology, the sciences, or a member of the ruling class. And I think, therefore, that Rishi Sunak fits that description. And I did find an interesting picture of Rishi Sunak and his wife when they were having some kind of tour in India. And there he is standing with a red string on his wrist, which he says is, of course, because the red string is worn to signify that you are Hindu. And I think that the purpose in Hinduism, it's kind of like a good luck thing. It brings you good luck. And there are some pictures of Tony Blair with his red string, and at the time he was doing these little photo ops. This was showing his support for the Hindu population in Great Britain. On the 6th of this month, I posted a short video from the Signs and Symbols series that a listener is providing for us, entitled Red String Club. I am going to post a link to that. I encourage you, if you haven't watched it, watch it. And if you have, watch it again after you listen to what Alan has to say in this talk about medieval stonemasons and the building of cathedrals, and how the grove is emulated in the flying buttresses, the arches in the church. And this is an emulation and a perfection of nature. This is interesting, the red string. Indo-Iranian languages made me think about Iran. And Iran was known as Persia. It's a very old civilization and an old country that has a tremendous importance in history. All we get is these evil, bad Iranians, axis of evil, that kind of thing. But it was important in history. And it's interesting to note that the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat was orchestrated by Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Here we go. So at the time, the Prime Minister of Iran was Mohammad Mossadegh. And he wanted to audit documents of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation now part of BP, to verify that AIOC was paying the contracted royalties to Iran and to limit the company's control over Iranian oil reserves. Upon AIOC's refusal to cooperate with the Iranian government, the parliament voted to nationalize Iran's oil industry and expel foreign corporate representatives from the country. After this vote, Britain instigated a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil to pressure Iran economically. Skipping just a little bit, Britain wanted to overthrow this government. They had approached the Truman administration in the U.S., but Truman opposed the coup. He feared the precedent that Central Intelligence Agency involvement would set. So once Truman was out of office, UK Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and the Eisenhower administration, and remember, Eisenhower is, beware the military-industrial complex, haha. So Churchill and the Eisenhower administration decided in early 1953 to overthrow Iran's government. And then we go from there to the installing the Shah of Iran, who was just a U.S. puppet. We've got the revolution of the overthrow in 1979. There's Ayatollah Khomeini. And then since 1989, Khomeini has been the head of Iran. I'm going to read you a story here from the press from yesterday. A warning from Syria as Middle East braces for Iran's revenge on Israel. Syria has issued a new warning to both Israel and the United States at a time when the Middle East is bracing for Iran's promised retaliation after an alleged Israeli attack on Tehran's embassy complex in Damascus. With the regional tensions already flaring over the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip, the Syrian mission to the United Nations conveyed to Newsweek the country's condemnation in the strongest terms of the Israeli attack that targeted the Iranian consulate building in Damascus. Now, as far as I know, Israel hasn't taken credit for that attack, but anyway, Syria went on to issue this. What the Zionist entity did in targeting the headquarters of a diplomatic mission in a populated area is not surprising, as this entity was built on killing, bloodshed, displacement, and plunder. The genocides and massacres that have been conducted by the Israeli entity and that have been continuing in Gaza for more than 6 months are nothing but the clearest evidence of the barbarity of this entity. I want you to think for a moment about Sykes. Well, I kind of wondered who was Sykes. Mark Sykes, I mentioned, like 6th Baronet, whatever. Sykes is described as being very instrumental in promoting the Balfour Declaration. He believed that the Bolsheviks were mostly Jewish, and that the best way of keeping Russia in the war was for Britain to make a pro-Jewish gesture. The Balfour Declaration stated, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, what is interesting here, this is from Wiki, tells us that Sykes had begun to, he was a big proponent of Zionism, He had met with Chaim Weizmann. He visited Palestine, I think, in 1916, and met with Chaim Weizmann, who was, one of the fathers of Zionism and the first prime minister of Israel, or president of Israel. He had been promoting Zionism for a couple of years, but his biographer writes here in 1923 that he had begun to change his views on Zionism in late 1918. From being the evangelist of Zionism during the war, he had returned to Paris with feelings shocked by the intense bitterness which had been provoked in the Holy Land. Matters had reached a stage beyond his conception of what Zionism would be. His last journey to Palestine had raised many doubts, which were not set at rest by a visit to Rome. To Cardinal Gasquet, he admitted the change of his views on Zionism and that he was determined to qualify, guide, and if possible, save the dangerous situation which was rapidly arising. If death had not been upon him, it would not have been too late. Well, I wonder about that, because Sykes was in Paris for the peace negotiations of 1919, and he died from the Spanish flu, we are told. And a diplomat there wrote in his diary at the time, it was due to his endless push and perseverance, to his enthusiasm and faith, that Arab nationalism and Zionism became two of the most successful of our war causes. After his death, Nahum Sokolow, a Russian Zionist colleague of Chaim Weizmann in Paris at the time, wrote that Sykes fell as a hero at our side. Certainly, one of the high sciences, I believe, which is probably hundreds of years ahead of where we think science is now, is the science of mind control. And when I look at Mark Sykes' house, his manor, I'm going to put up some pictures of that. It's called Sledmere House. And it's been around and in the family and still with the family since 1750, something like that. So mind control. Rishi Sunak, the way all of our leaders live by and large. People, we think, we are somehow made to think that people who live in such wealth are one of us. They see themselves as our betters, a sort of caste system. So Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor, this is from yesterday. Leonardo DiCaprio urges Scottish government ministers to declare Scotland a rewilding nation. Leonardo DiCaprio has joined Scottish environmentalists in urging ministers to declare the country a rewilding nation. The American actor, and he is called an environmentalist, took to Instagram to share the message of the Scottish Rewilding Alliance with his 61.1 million followers. The alliance is a coalition of more than 20 nature organizations urging the Scottish government to declare Scotland as the first rewilding nation in an effort to boost conservation strategies. He posted, Scotland could be a world leader in rewilding its landscapes, ensuring clean air and water, storing carbon, reducing flooding, restoring wildlife, and improving the lives of locals. There aren't going to be, between the Highland clearances and the fact that they have been after Scotland for several hundred years, and their new hate crime bill where everyone will either be locked up or for offending some transgender somewhere, there aren't going to be any locals left who need their lives improved. Leonardo DiCaprio has been spotted for years wearing the red string bracelet, and it has raised so much comment that, I don't know, his publicist or agent or whatever has seen fit to publish a few articles over the years. This one is from 2016. Leo DiCaprio's red string is not a Kabbalah bracelet. No, Leo DiCaprio has not converted to Kabbalah. He was spotted meeting Pope Francis wearing the symbol of Jewish mysticism, and he was wearing it at some awards ceremony, and it said, oh no, he just was in Cambodia, and he picked it up there when he visited a temple at Angkor Wat. So there you go. That's the story of his bracelet. But I posit that they are all in a different kind of club, above Hinduism, above Kabbalah, in their own illumined club. So consider that. Consider that. If these religions, Kabbalah, Hinduism, etc., have been created and managed for many, many years, could there not? Is it not possible that there is something above them all? Aryan, Proto-Iranian, meaning of the Iranians. But it is also a derivative of Proto-Indo-European language from the word Aryo, one who assembles skillfully. One who assembles skillfully. Master builder. Well, that is my non-linear mind trip, and I can guarantee you that it very much beats the hellishness that was outside of my own head this week, and that may continue for a while. So those of you who pray, send them up for me. And those of you who just send out positive thoughts and good vibes, I can use those too. Please enjoy Alan's talk and listen very carefully. It's so wonderful, as always. Have a good week.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't Jackie, as you can tell. She's got a very bad cold. It's Alan, who Jackie phoned me up about an hour ago and asked me to stand in for her. I had nothing planned, of course, I never do. I generally just talk as to what comes into my head first. Having so much data from the media doesn't mean they're telling you anything that really matters. And certainly, of course, that's the trick of it all. It's the last thing someone would expect when you have such so-called free media, that they're simply feeding you useless data and trivia generally, or propaganda, but seldom giving you any truth. And of course, whatever governments have done in history is always an exoteric for the public, and the esoteric, they sometimes give you the truth 50 years after an event, after the Official Secrets Act time has expired, and sometimes they won't. They'll reclassify it for another 50 years. For the free trade negotiations that were done back in the 80s, and they buried most of the contracts, really, between the countries involved. That was the precursor to NAFTA, and was actually more important than NAFTA, because preambles tell you the meanings of the words they'll be using in the actual official document. And they're very often very different from the ones you'd think they actually meant. So the free trade negotiations were classified and buried in some underground bunker outside Ottawa, and they won't be open for another 50 years or so. By that time, if there are still people around who can think, which I tend to doubt, to be honest with you, they'll gladly show it to you, because a future generation doesn't care what happened in ancient history. 50 years today is ancient history, and with the Dewey system well underway in the school system, any real history's been pretty well chopped out. It's hard to find a student today, around 16, who knows when World War I began and finished. never mind World War II, and who participated in it. And this is all by design, because they said that any conflicts that might go on down through the generations because of racial differences or whatever would have to be removed from the history books. And this has been going on under the National Educational Association, which is a part of the International Educational Association, and the whole world has been standardized to the same system under the United Nations. So we have lots of data to keep us occupied, but there's very little truth that we can use unless we really dig into it and use our own reasoning power, because the big boys will never come out and tell you what they've really done to you, what they are really doing to you, and what they plan to do to you. Since we are going along in a system which has been here for thousands of years, where they have good shepherds. Today they wear business suits. Sometimes in past history they wore uniforms, like Adolf Hitler and Stalin and so on. And we still have our friend in Cuba, of course. And through the uniform, which is one form, that's what uniforms mean. Masonics make one form out of many, one, you see. And one system, one world, all of this kind of stuff. You'll find that in our minds we expect to see dictators or tyrants in a uniform who yell and scream at their audience and gesticulate with wild gestures like Mussolini. And that's why they keep showing us these old cuts every so often. They seem to crop up all the time. And that's to condition us this way. And so when we see a guy in a business suit, you see, who doesn't yell and scream, at least not publicly, we can't see him as being a dictator or a tyrant. It's very misleading, because they can say things much, much worse than any tyrant has ever said publicly in a nice, gentle way. And the viewers simply are not conditioned, or they're deconditioned, not to actually see what they're seeing or hear what they're hearing. I think Mr. Bush himself said that the Constitution of the United States was just a piece of paper, which is odd, because I'd said that on Jackie's show back in '98. And it is. No piece of paper can stand up and demand your rights. It's the people who back it and who want that to be so, who make it so. And if they don't care, well, they don't care. It is a piece of paper. That's the reality of the world we live in. But the good shepherds, as I say, who run the world, and it's not the front men we see, the shepherds, the true shepherds, seldom go amongst the sheep. They pay their front men to do that, and of course the sheep like the shepherd. They think he's a good guy. He wears a business suit. Even the one in communist China wears a business suit. So these shepherds wear business suits, and they have nice scripts, because they have the best script writers in the world, who must have a common education from some strange underground university, because they all advise their frontmen in the same speeches and to pass the same laws worldwide at the same time. And yet we never hear how come these advisors, who are unelected, of course, in any country, we never hear how they get these positions, or who trains them, and who authorizes them to be where they are. But they do write good speeches. They're Hollywood-type scripts, right down to the pauses that the presidents and prime ministers make, even the little jokes they sometimes tell. As anyone who watched the movie Wag the Dog, I'm sure saw, we're living in Disneyland, really. Very much so, and it isn't simply because we've woken up into Disneyland. Disneyland was here long before Disney. The ancients knew, and anyone who studied the history of India, ancient history, will come across certain princes who moved into India. These are the ones who did call themselves the Aryan race, whom the Brahmins supposedly are descended from. They moved into the Dravidians, the name given to the people who were originally there. They knew which religions to use for the particular people they took over. you'll find fantastic planning going in to the creation of religions specifically tailored for the inhabitants of different areas of India. According to the culture they had at that time, they could actually adapt or tailor-make these religions to the people, or for the people, and the people would, in fact, obey them. They would obey all the rules they were given because it seemed fairly logical, the way it was presented to them. And the reason this formula worked then, and it works today, is that people are trained in one generation to listen today to experts. In ancient times it was holy men, and the holy men would be backed up with other priests, and they would actually go out amongst the people, teach one generation the set of rules, the reasons why they must obey the rules, because there was a deity either watching them invisibly all the time, or else, they went into the reincarnation thing where you're poor and destitute because you chose to be so, and that's why you're in that position. But if you work really hard and lick my boots, and if you create anything at all, I want a cut of it, or I want a share of it through money. If you do these kind of things to one who's superior to you, you might just come back in a higher position the next time. And strange as it sounds today, these religions work very, very well for thousands of years for a small elite ruling group. And all they had to do was train one generation. And that's all they were taught. They couldn't read or write. They believed priests and monks and so on. They had tailor-made religions given to them. Psychological warfare par excellence. Nothing could be improved upon for the last few thousand years. In the last 100 or more, actually, they've been using electronic backups and various other techniques, Pavlovian-type indoctrinations, to make us linear thinking, as they call it. And linear thinking is the reason most people can't ever figure out what's really happening, even the ones who think they're waking up. They might catch on to the banking system, or the constitution's going down the drain, or we're amalgamating, or losing something, but they're still really in a higher level of level 1 reality, because this planet is far beyond simple changes that are happening today. Is far more occult than that. Sciences are used beyond the comprehension of most people. Apart from the very, very advanced electronics which are used, there are other means of applying science or transmitting signals, we might say. And where they are scientifically, I don't believe is just 50 years ahead. I think the proof in Francis Bacon's little essay on the New Atlantis, written in the late 1500s and published 1602, where he goes into Solomon's Island, which is actually Salmon's Island. It's a play on the word salmon for its red flesh, because the color of this agenda is always red. Francis Bacon talks about, eventually, the last chapter, he talks about getting into the underground chambers or laboratories, where he saw something powering the underground facilities that gave off the light of the sun. Now today we would say that's nuclear energy. And then of course he talks about going into another lab where they had a machine to control the weather and create hurricanes, storms, droughts, famines, and earthquakes, which sounds suspiciously like HAARP today. And going on from there, he goes into the genetically modified vegetable and animal area. He doesn't use those terms. He says where they take the most minuscule parts of life and work on them and create any kind of vegetable. Or, he said, animal, and I presume human, of course, that's what you're supposed to come to yourself. And then they know exactly how it will end up when they first start the stages of planning. In other words, they weren't experimenting and doing it for the first time. When you get these kind of clues from someone who was living in the 1500s, writing supposedly with beeswax candles, the best form of transportation was sailing ships and canvas, or on land it was a horse and buggy. He's coming up with incredible stories which a crystal ball couldn't have told him. He didn't claim to be a medium either, so it would tell me that they had these sciences. And of course, to control the world for thousands of years, not just control it, but this world's been heading towards or along a set plan, a set agenda for thousands of years. It would tell you that they would never allow the general population to know how far ahead they truly are. So while the people of the Middle Ages were living in the Middle Ages, those who were controlling the Middle Ages were probably living, what we might say, in the 20th or 21st centuries with the sciences that they actually had. And so you get these kinds of proofs popping up. Lady Queensborough, who wrote about Freemasonry in the 1800s, talked about one of her friends, who I think was an ambassador, who went to the Grand Orient Lodge in France prior to the telephone, met the Grand Master. That's after, of course, Benjamin Franklin was the Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France. They were having tea with a silver tea set, and he heard a ringing noise coming from the teapot. The guy pushed something, the lid came up, and he talked into it. And he says, "You'll never guess where I'm talking to." So it was some other country across an ocean. So the telephone was here, and by the way, it was probably cellular, because we don't think we had wires laid at that time. That came later on. So these things were reported and observed back in the early 1800s. Lord Rothschild was also reported to have his little ventriloquist box. They had cartoons in British newspapers, and that's what he always pulled out when he was making these big deals, such as taking over the Bank of England, because he just knew who'd won the battle before anyone else did. So he liked to talk to himself in this little box, you know. Of course, the official version is he had a fast fleet of clipper ships that got there before anyone else got the news, and then a horseman rode into London, told him who'd won. He dumped his bonds. Everyone thought that the British had lost, and then he bought them all up for peanuts. All very legal, and which is always a strange thing I've noticed in this system. No matter how corrupt they are, they tend not to break laws, because they write the laws so that they can do what they want, basically. Certainly very immoral. But then again, if we look at the rule book, which is the Old Testament, we have to admit that the old God blessed Jacob for conning his old father into believing that he was really the brother. So in order to get the blessings, the old father was blind and half deaf, and so he dressed up like his brother with the woolly or woolskin shirt, and got him his favorite bowl of soup and stew and so on, and he got the blessings, and he ended up supposedly being in charge of the 12 tribes, which doesn't mean 12 tribes at all, and Jacob didn't mean Jacob. Jacob was the sun, and the tribes were the constellations. That's really what it meant. And so he'd broken through into the light of the sun. He became as the sun, and that's the test of the very highest pinnacle of Freemasonry, when you hit 360 degrees, because that's what it takes to go around a circle. Anyway, we've been lied to, conned mightily for thousands of years. Every generation has been brought up to believe they're on the cutting edge. When they were dying like flies in factories during the Industrial Revolution in Europe, when the plague carts went around to collect the dead who died of overwork and malnutrition, often for working 16 hours per day, including Sundays, by the way. The day off on Sunday came much, much later. But the people in those days thought, what else could they do? It's just the way it was. That's how we've evolved, as they would say in Darwinistic circles. You can help the poor so much, but what else can you do for them? What they don't tell you is that Mr. Rothschild, once he'd taken over the Bank of England, and personally I believe he was brought in by the elite already in Britain to run it more efficiently, when he was created Lord Rothschild, he passed the Corn Laws Act, where they could bring in foreign corn and so on and dump it on the British market. It put all the tiny landowners out of business. They were forced then to go into the cities because that's where they wanted them, so they could work the factories. And everything happens, you find, in this order. There's no happenstance to anything. The people are coerced. The world is pre-planned. The destiny of the world is pre-planned, then as it is now. And whatever you think is happening now, you're generally wrong. The media's job, the media means the middle. You see, pyramid is, of course, fire in the middle too. It's a fire between the capstone and the rest of the world, meaning the body. The media's job is to communicate certain data to you to shape your mind on an ongoing basis into expecting the next move, which will seem perfectly natural to us by the way it's explained. The fact that, for instance, the New American Century published their agenda in the 1990s, beginning with an attack on Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Iran, and then Syria, in that order, and the fact that we did hit Afghanistan first, after 9/11, the emergency number, coincidentally, of course, and then go into Iraq. And during the inquiry, Mr. Bush did admit on Canadian television, at least, that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with the Twin Tower bombing. He was just a bad guy that was in the way, and the world was better off with him removed. And now, of course, they're beating the war drums for Iran. I'm sure they have their own man in Iran, because each time he says something about the New World Order or Israel, I'm sure the population are quivering in fear, because why would a man bring on disaster when the world's biggest army is right next door to him, ready to move in? Why would he do this? Until you realize that the old assassin, the assassins, it's called assassin, and that's where the word hashish comes from, since that's what they basically lived on. That was in the Middle East. And the Knights Templars, in fact, joined forces with the assassin and became one. So I'm pretty sure this guy who's in charge of Iran and who's making these big noises right now at the most inappropriate time is one of their own. And if anything does happen, I'm sure he'll be picked up or smuggled out, or one way or another, before all hell breaks loose. And you'll find that's how the game truly is played, because wars, as Professor Carl Quigley said, are not intended simply to beat another people. They're primarily to change the culture of all the participants. So it's the little people who have to change in the aftermath of war. It changes the culture. Such as Britain, when it came out of World War II, it went into World War II to fight National Socialism and ended World War II as a National Socialistic country. That's how it changed it. The big boys understood that that was their goal. It's hard for the average person to ever figure out how it happened, how it came about, because that was the plan in the first place. Hitler wanted a united Europe. Winston Churchill, we're told now, with declassified documents by his personal secretary 50 years after the Official Secrets Act is up, Churchill spoke many times about a united Europe coming out of World War II. So regardless who they decided to win, you'd got a united Europe anyway. So it's the sheep who must be conditioned for the changes, not the people who lead us to the changes, but the people themselves. And I've been just going through various things that flit through my head, of course, and that's why I prefer not to be a linear thinker. To be a linear thinker is to show that your conditioning through schooling has worked. Because linear thinking is always to do with what they call logic and set formats, where you look at a subject, you find out why the subject is the subject, what caused it to be so, what its purpose is, where does it go from here, etc., etc. It's a mathematical sequence, and so when you're given a problem, you think linearly, and you come to the conclusion really that's programmed for you to come to, which is always the wrong one. It keeps us in the dark. If you're non-linear, you can jump back and forth between various topics and time and history, because it all must be shown together. How everything that's happening today is simply a lead up, or was led up to by preparations done thousands of years ago. I put some of this in my 3 books for sale, and I should mention them now. I do some of the ancient history, the pre-Masonic, but still the builders, of course, history of ancient Egypt, etc. I show you much of the Masonic symbolism, although that's been co-opted by one of the main superstars of shortwave, who's adopted this kind of stuff, because they must get themselves put as the superstars, so you'll be led up the garden path. But it doesn't matter anyway, because they never give you the truly esoteric meanings anyway. So if you want one or any of these books, or all 3, they're $25 US each. So these books, as I say, go up through that. The 3rd book was into that as well. I show you the big coincidences in history, such as the statue of Rhodes, which was the capital of the big banking boys thousands of years ago, BC. The statue of Rhodes, of course, had the sun god with his spikes coming out of his head. He had his right hand out. Some ancient historians say he held the torch there. There was definitely a beacon there. Of course, people today will say, gee, that's a similarity to the statue in New York, quite near Rhodes, in fact, isn't it? But it must be coincidence, mustn't it? For you're seeing the same symbols of unbroken power from thousands of years ago up until today, and you can't put it all together. That's quite something. Because these symbols have been used all down through history, through every religion on the planet, every authorized religion, and the esoteric is always hidden from the public, or the profane as they call it. It's also hidden from the low-degree Freemasons, because you must have willing fools, as Mr. Pike said himself, who don't know that they're fools. They think they're there for charity and do self-help work and all that kind of stuff. That's how the world really runs. Everybody's in a little pigeonhole or a tunnel, and they don't know there's another tunnel next to them, and there's a whole bunch of tunnels next to them. They only live in their own little tunnel from the day they're born to the day they die. It's very interesting. If we even go back to the times of Sumer, you'll see the statues of the priests of Sumer, and it's very interesting that they wore the sheepskin skin around their loins. And of course, it's the same today. The proper Masonic pinafore, the apron, is also made of sheepskin. At least the good ones are. And of course, you've got to ask yourself, is there a wolf behind the sheep here? Or is that just Viagra? Because these guys love to boast, and they certainly do. So we have the same symbology down through the ages of the shepherd people, you see, the sheepskin. Those who wear the sheepskin, they make the sheep around them believe they're one of us, and we don't realize that the shepherd's very different from us, because the shepherd actually owns us, and we feed him, and we clothe him. If the sheep knew that, they'd run a mile if they saw the shepherd. But of course, the sheep don't know that. They see business suits and well-dressed people who are obviously expert at running things, and so we like them just like the sheep. No different than ancient times. We give it all to the good shepherds who are promoted to us, so that we might follow them. The only duty we have as a citizen in any country, and you've got to realize a citizen, the definition is someone born into a system with pre-existing duties. So, in other words, if you have pre-existing duties, how can you be free? you see. It takes a little bit of thinking there, but we can overcome that barrier. We have pre-existing duties, and of course part of that is always to pay off debt. Even though Benjamin Franklin, a member of Illuminati, who gives you a lot of the clues, they speak openly, because I guess they have to really give you very easy clues. And he said, Jefferson said, he said, a generation born into paying off the debt incurred from a previous generation are de facto slaves. Today we call it democracy and freedom. It's quite amazing how we can be told the truth by some of the illumined ones down through history, and we think, well, so what? You know, everything's fine. I'm okay, Jack. How are you? We ignore the truth. So yeah, from the sheepskins of the ancient Sumerian priests, you look at the pharaohs, of course, of Egypt, and they wore a cloth round them. You also see it was hung in the middle in a pyramid-type shape, from the below the belly button down to above the knees, like a kilt. And of course, he wore that type because he's a perfect pyramid. He is at the top of the pyramid, actually. The ones below would have to have ones with a flat square because they don't have a capstone. So nothing really has changed to today. What we call Freemasonic is to shape and build culture and society and man himself. We look at the ancient builders of the medieval times, and when they were building up a cathedral, they were also dismantling the old one. So they dismantle the past as they're putting up the new structure. This goes on and on through all of the symbology. Eventually they will reshape man, and it's not far off. They've got the ability to do it. It's not because they're waiting to improve the abilities to do it that they're hanging on. They're getting us already mentally and psychologically to accept the big changes which are coming in a physical realm, because they've always said their job was to perfect that which was left imperfect. The guide to Solomon's temple is that the individual enlightened one is the temple. You see, you are a temple, but it's imperfect for the masses, and therefore they're going to perfect it. So the next type of working type people they will create will be purposely made for their task, just like Brave New World. Aldous Huxley did not get his ideas from again a crystal ball. Aldous Huxley was the grandson of Professor Thomas Huxley, who was Charles Darwin's best buddy, and he became the champion of Darwinism after Darwin died. Aldous Huxley got his information from inner circles of the elite in Britain, from the universities, and simply wrote them into his books. He said on his speeches that he knew this would be put into operation, the Brave New World scenario, where they will purposely grow people for specific tasks. And here's another big coincidence, because we jump back to Plato's Republic. When Plato, in his discourse, talks about the creation of a perfect world state, where the guardian class won't have to utilize so much time and energy to watch all the workers and slave populations, because they will purposely make the slave populations for their own particular functions. That was called the Republic, and that was his form of a utopia. Utopia to them is when they don't have to give you entertainment, distractions, frivolous wars, that type of things, dramas, plays, music, to entertain us. They won't have to. Will be very, very efficient, because they'll program people after creating them to do their work 24 hours a day. They won't need entertainment. So Plato himself did not dream up that idea, since Plato was a pupil of Socrates. Socrates, of course, was forced to drink the hemlock after being convicted. And his conviction was that he'd been recruiting the elite youth and training them through a secret society to infiltrate the power structure and cause revolution. Socrates and Plato both studied this in Egypt. And so you look back at Egypt and you find that all of these elite people who went to study there were initiated into the high mystery religions, and then they were sent back to the original countries to set up these little cult groups and train the youth through fascinating stories, which is the same today, of the supposed esoteric, but they don't tell them esoteric, and fomenting revolution. All must become one. Out of many, one, reverse it, one out of many. You might also say monopoly, mono, one, poly, many. And that's what the United States has been famous for, is the creation of monopolies. E pluribus unum. So anyway, this has always been their agenda. You see it all down through history if we care to look. It is not a coincidence. And we're dealing with something here which obviously, very obviously, does not think in completing any one thing in a lifetime, a human span. We're dealing with something which can make incredible plans thousands of years into the future, right down to the finish dates too. And it also knew the wisdom of the past, meaning the studying of human nature for thousands of years in ancient times, to plan out a destination to bring mankind, culminating in a world order, a new world order, which of course in a coincidence Papa Bush mentioned in September the 11th in 1990. All these coincidences are just tripping us up everywhere. But yeah, we're dealing with something which is beyond simply the human. It does teach humans as well, of course, the little workers they have, in a religious format, because there's a religion behind this, a definite religion. That's what motivates natural man, is dedication to a religion, especially when it gives members special privileges in this world. But whatever is behind it, as we know, it doesn't worry about dying in a generation or so. That's fairly obvious. It's also obvious that humans are not apt to plan something a generation ahead and carry it out. Other things crop up. Finances have to be pushed elsewhere. Unexpected things happen, and people just get plain tired. But there's something here driving this generation between one to the next, and the next. If we look at the cathedrals of England and Europe, and we realize that these cathedrals took 5 to 7 generations of stonemasons to build, through famines, through plagues, through crusades, where the money was getting taken to go off abroad, massive money from the public. And yet this agenda to build the cathedrals never ceased. Never ceased. And architects today, trained architects who go over to study these cathedrals in Europe, are flabbergasted at the sciences which were used to bring these inner domed vaults, etc., together. I don't know how many of them, I'm sure the Masonic ones did, but I don't know how many of them noticed that really these arches within these cathedrals and their big beams and all the rest of it are simply a sculptured form of nature, because it's showing you a grove. These cathedrals inside simulate the tree people have, it seems. And the ability to put all of this work together, incredible creations, is almost beyond the modern architect and builders societies and so on. They couldn't do it so well. So we're living with all of these amazing coincidences, and we're taught at school we're on the cutting edge of science and civilization, and who knows what we'll discover next is going to push us in a great leap forward. But in reality, the sciences that are hidden from the public have been available for at least 500 years, and probably longer. We look at the explosion of microcircuitry that first appeared in wristwatches back in the 1970s, which flourished overnight. The markets in all countries were dumped with these cheap watches, which were battery operated and kept perfect time, digital readouts and all the rest of it, and played about 3 or 4 different tunes, etc., and put the Swiss watchmaking businesses out of business overnight. And I saw many of my friends buying them, and yet what amazed me was none of them were stunned as to where this technology had suddenly come from. They take it for granted. You see, most people take everything that happens for granted. They don't question it. Most people alive today lived through the big transition of all the major industry in the world over the last 15 years to China. And yet very few were conscious of it. They dreamed through it, and now they simply think it's normal that everything's made in China. So people don't really live through their life. Living means being a sentient being. Sentience is awareness. And people who don't ask questions are obviously not aware. And Plato, jumping back then in non-linear thinking, of course, Plato himself said we create culture. He said we can give opposite. He's talking about the elite, of course, of ancient times. He says all culture comes from the top. Culture that came out from the bottom could upset, have a ripple effect and destroy everything. The unpredictable, you see. So all cultural changes are from the top down. They're permissible and planned by the top and implemented. And of course the people who see the culture changes through generally music, according to Plato. Today it's much music. Then it was just roving musicians. They had roving troops of drama players. And of course he said people mimic what they see on stage. So the general public simply mimic what they see, the fashions and so on. And Plato said we can literally change the culture and all of its values in a completely opposite direction within one generation. In that generation, there'll hardly be one person who actually was conscious through the transition. And that is true today. It's no different today. The public go through the transitions without noticing them. Even if the skirt goes from an ankle to halfway up the thigh, in one generation, it's somehow normal. And it's normal because it's approved from the top, because anything that was not approved from the top, believe you me, would be nipped in the bud before the public even heard about it. And if you wonder why pop stars who helped bring in the drugs, sex, rock and roll, which eventually destroyed what was left of the family, were getting knighted by the Queen. You know, the Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD, who turned on millions of people into drugs, got knighted for helping what? What did they help in the system? And what we know is, of course, that they had to destroy the remnants of the family unit by creating promiscuity, which they'd planned in the 1800s. H.G. Wells was promoting free love, they called it, in 1885. Free love. But they didn't have the contraceptives, and the fallout was disastrous. So they went back to the drawing board and had all the scientists work on the contraceptive pill. So they put that out forward with the National Health Service, which gave you free abortion, and penicillin for the diseases, and reapplied it using music, the traditional Plato thing, you see, fashion, the miniskirt, formulas. These are simple formulas, and they work very well. The public didn't notice the change. They never thought, why did it come this way? Where does fashion come from? Who authorizes fashion? And fashion, remember, means to shape. So it's Masonic, you see, as everything else in this world is. Uniform, as I say, uniform. People in uniform are one form. And that's why armies have been created for thousands of years. And once again, you've got many acting as one. They're drawn from the ranks of the people at the bottom, drilled, just like miners, in a sense, because that's where drilling comes from. Square bashing, it's Masonic, so they walk the square, they drill on the square. And they have one form when they're ready, and they'll do whatever they're told, even if it means going and bashing their parents on the skulls with the butt of their guns. They'll do it because all of this has been done before, down through history. And here is this music coming, so I guess the time is rolling to a head. Well, I'll end with that rant, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you. It's non-linear thinking, which I enjoy, of course. And Jackie will be back on Monday to talk to you.